So we'll start with just a brief review of what we were talking about last night, but then we're going to change gears and we're going to go through an exercise for Sabbath school today. So just a brief recap of what we spoke about. So last night we were mentioning we had some questions. It was sort of a impromptu question and answer kind of session that we did. And we had some questions about the Constitution and some of the things that are going on with Trump today, and President Trump, and specifically Sister Antonisha had some questions about the relationship between the King of the South and the King of the North in terms of how they parallel each other, the similarities and the differences between them, and that led us on to a larger thought where we were discussing how what President Trump is doing today, the way we all know that he's doing something bad. He's involved in a bad work, but identifying that work is difficult at times. And the reason for that is some of the things he does aren't explicitly illegal. And our question was, well, if it's not explicitly illegal, why is it bad? And if it doesn't directly break the Constitution or some law that is there, why can we say that, some of his rhetoric is bad, or some of this is, some of his actions are bad? We specifically looked at one of his tweets yesterday that seemed to influence the Department of Justice in one of their actions just yesterday or 2 days ago. And in that conversation, what we developed was the idea that many of the things he's doing is not breaking the law, but he's breaking the spirit of those laws, the intent of those laws. And what we looked at specifically was the idea of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that while Trump is not breaking many of the things or most of the things in the Constitution in terms of his role, what he is breaking through his actions is the spirit, which is highlighted in the Declaration of Independence. So the relationship we saw between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was the Declaration of Independence was the spirit of the law, and the Constitution was the letter of the law. Another way of saying that is the Declaration of Independence describes the purpose and the function of the Constitution. And we need to be able to identify the spirit or the principle, if I could interchange the word spirit with principle, behind the constitutional concepts to see what Trump is doing that's bad. Because many of the things, like we said, the example we gave last night was there is a case going against Roger Stone, one of his associates, during his campaign. And I think he got caught on several charges, but one of them was perjury, lying to the FBI investigators. And he was going to be sentenced, I think, off of memory, could be wrong about the time, 7 to 9 years. And Trump, on hearing this announcement publicly, it was public information, made a tweet that said, I forgot exactly what it said specifically, but basically he was critical of that decision. And within a couple hours, the Department of Justice, the head of the Department of Justice, which is the Attorney General, announced that he was going to intercede on behalf of Roger Stone, or just get into the investigation. And he halved the sentence. I think it was to 3 to 4 years instead of 7 to 9, or something to that effect. It was about half. Exactly. And we're saying, well, if you look at that, we all understand that that's wrong, but why is that wrong? And we started looking at that, and what we saw was that Trump made a tweet on public information. So he wasn't commenting on anything. He wasn't commenting on some classified information. He wasn't giving more information than was supposed to be there. He was just commenting on his perspective about an investigation that was ongoing, or the sentencing of this investigation, which he's allowed to do. It's public information. And we saw that the Attorney General was also doing something similar, and that he was going to, it is not necessarily wrong or illegal for the Attorney General to condescend to an investigator or a specific court case that's going on with his prosecutors his federal prosecutors, and enact some sort of change if he sees fit. He has the unilateral ability to do that. And we walked through that and we saw that neither what the Attorney General did or the President did was explicitly illegal. But we all know it's wrong. It smells of something wrong. And, yep.
It smells fishy.
Say again?
Fishy.
It smells fishy. There's something wrong with it. And what we identified was the idea that while he's not breaking the actual law, him or the Attorney General, what they're doing is they're breaking the idea of fair governance. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the Declaration of Independence, probably today. The idea that it is a government that is impartial, that there's impartial justice, that there's proper checks and balances, that one of the branches is not getting, and we had the branches up here yesterday, but one of the branches isn't higher than the other and influencing them in improper ways. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing these subtle influences that add up to a corrupting effect on our institutions and on law and on policy, while at the same time not being explicitly illegal. And we identified that these things were loopholes. And one of the examples that we gave of this was the idea of children. And we said that if you gave children Nerf guns or some sort of water pistol or something, and you just gave them these toys, and you gave them then, and you just expect them to do the right thing, well, once they start shooting each other, then you say, okay, no shooting each other in the face. You're going to poke an eye out. And what do the kids do? They start shooting other places. Maybe they'll shoot the side of the head or the back of the head or, the ears or something. They'll find a way to inflict pain even without breaking the explicit law that you set. And then what do you have to do? You have to make another law to say, okay, no shooting on the side of the head. And so because these kids are only living by the letter of your law, and they're corrupt, and I'm not speaking ill of children, I'm just trying to create a dynamic here. And they're trying to find a way around your law, but they're living by the letter of the law. They'll find loopholes. They'll find loopholes to get around what you're saying, and eventually they will get around it and they will break, even though they're not breaking the letter of the law that you gave, they will 100% break the principle of your law or the spirit that is behind your law. So for instance, the idea of not shooting your friend or your sibling with one of these guns, these toys, is the idea of loving your neighbor, or not inflicting harm to your sibling or your friend. But they're going to find a way around that, a way around the law to break the principle. And we used a good example of this, a biblical example with the Jews. The Jews were 100% keeping Sabbath. But what we identified is that they were 100% breaking Sabbath. And the way they were doing that was that they were following the letter of these laws, while at the same time breaking the spirit of that law, breaking the rest, breaking the principles of Sabbath. And they did this with almost all of the law that was given to them in their time, with the Ten Commandments and some of Mosaic law. They're going to break the spirit of it while following it in its letter form. And this is the same thing we see happening today with not just conservatives or Republicans, but also with the president. So that's a general summary of what we talked about, and we identified that this spirit of the law, these principles, that all law is based upon two fundamental principles or themes, and it's the idea of loving God and loving your neighbor. And both of those existed from the creation of Adam and Eve. The second Adam and Eve were created, both were instituted because they had a relationship to their God, their creator, but they had a relationship to each other. And we can see that here in this diagram. And all law is based upon those two principles of love for God and love for neighbor. And we identified that even the Ten Commandments are not perfect in the way that they express their law because it's limited. And we used the example of adultery that Christ identified. He said, don't commit adultery, but they find a way to get around committing explicit adultery, having an affair or something like that. And what they do is they lust after their neighbor. And in doing that, they've found a loophole around the Ten Commandments that, though is not explicitly breaking the letter of the law of adultery, it is adultery still because of the fact that the spirit of that is being broken. Because it's not just about whether you're in the act, it's about the mindset, the motives, and all of those things behind that. And that all funnels down into our idea of what's happening with Donald Trump and in that issue there. He's end up breaking the spirit while he's following the letter in some ways, but in some ways there's been issues with even the letter. And I think in a lot of ways the whole Ukrainian thing, the Ukrainian phone call is an issue of this. And yes, the Democrats are identifying that he's broken the law explicitly, but the reason they're saying he broke the law explicitly was because of the spirit of that law. He didn't explicitly break law. He broke the spirit of that law, and they're saying by breaking that spirit, he's broken the law.
So is that the reason why he got off?
Part of the reason, yeah, because it's not so easy to pin it down. And only half the people, a little bit less than half the people, agreed that he was even breaking the spirit of the law. Actually, if you look at it, not many, but a handful, enough to have gotten him convicted, believe that what he was doing was wrong, it just wasn't illegal.
So has this got a lot to do with perception as well?
Yes, yeah, perception is part of this for sure. And it's having a correct perception of it is important because it's going to change your view of these two things. And so we talked about that for a bit, and we saw how these principles funnel into the end of the world. And we saw that in our day and age that there were two attempts by Christ, not in our day and age, sorry, in recent history there were two attempts by Christ to come back to earth. And it was during the 1863 time, and we know that was a failure, and also in the 1888 history, and that was a failure. And both of these histories have a crisis that's related to them, to a specific theme. And what I mean by that is the history of 1863 was slavery, and the history of the Sunday law was, or the history of 1888 was the Sunday law. And these two examples we identified need to be looked at as parables, and we combine them together and bring them into our history. And whatever these look like combined will give us what our Sunday law looks like in our history. And we identified that the fundamental principle of slavery is that it's an offense against your neighbor and the subjugation of your neighbor, the subjugation and oppression of your neighbor. And the issue with Sunday was a offense against God, because you're breaking the fourth commandment. And here we saw what we have here, the 6 and the 4, is that with slavery we saw that it goes against the 6 commandments of the 10 commandments that have to do with your neighbor, and with the Sunday law, it breaks the 4 commandments which have to do with God, your relationship to God, which is what we see here with Adam and Eve, relationship to God and neighbor, a responsibility. And both of those combine together to give us our Sunday law. And what we said is the way it's going to pan out in our history is that our neighbor is the issue of equality, and God is the issue of a correct understanding of church and state. And the way we identified these two was by going back into our history, our reform line. We spoke about this a little bit, and we saw that the themes of equality or an issue of neighbor we saw specifically in racism and sexism, and for the issue with God or the relationship towards God, we saw that the evangelicals are trying to do an illegal or an illicit relationship between the church and the state. And the reason we did that was because we have to have a thread that weaves through our reform line, and the issue of the evangelicals and the issue of racism and sexism are threads that we can pull through all the way along our line to get the specificity we need for identifying what these crises will be here at the end. So that is a summary of what we've done so far. And like I said, this was a little bit out of context of the study, not out of the context of the study, but out of the sequence of the study. So what we're going to do is, what we're going to do now is we're going to pull back a little bit, and we're going to work back to some of these themes, and we'll start looking at them from a little bit different angles, and that's what we'll be doing today. But what we want to do for Sabbath School with our remaining time is we want to...
I'm sorry, Equal Rights Amendment.
What? Oh, sorry, yes. So what we had for the Equal Rights Amendment, this was another question we had. The Equal Rights Amendment is an amendment that says women should be given the full social equality to men. I forget when this amendment was passed. Tanisha, you said it was in 1920s. This amendment was proposed. Let's say proposed, not passed. Was proposed, and there was...
Is this for women?
For women, yes.
Well, black women only got the right in 1926.
Mm-hmm.
White women got that earlier.
Mm-hmm. So here we're talking about the issue of, I think if I remember correctly, this is a social equality, not just voting. I don't think it had to do with voting because they get that through other amendments. This is social equality, overall. And what the question was regarding this is that while this was in the 1920s that they're going to propose this amendment, they had until, 1982 to pass that amendment, to ratify the amendment, and they failed to ratify it. But the issue is that today, in the last couple of years, several states have ratified this amendment, even though it's past the due date. And we were talking about, well, do those ratifications actually count, or is it not enough? Or do they have to start the process over? And we identified that technically they have to start the process over because they passed the due date for when these ratifications needed to be in 1982. And so those ratifications that we saw today were more of political statements about the issue of equality more than they are substantial. Yep.
What do you mean by ratification? I don't understand that.
So ratification is another word of saying established. It's another way of saying that. So if I propose something, in this sort of legal framework, I propose it, you need to ratify it. And what that means is you're going to establish it by a vote in your state. So what happened, as we identified yesterday, was that this was proposed, and it's going to go to all the states, and all the states have to vote on it in their individual states' legislatures to pass or ratify this amendment. And if you have enough ratification, it becomes law. And we said, I think it's 2/3 that they needed, 66% of the United States. Okay, any other questions with that? Okay, so what we're going to do, so that's pretty much everything on the board. I'm going to erase it now. So as we said yesterday, as we were talking about yesterday, we want participation because we have a small group, so it's very easy, and we don't have a agenda we have to get through. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a little bit of a class exercise for Sabbath School about methodology. So what we want to do is we want to talk about Revelation 13. But let me work us up to that thought. That's where we'll be going, so you can turn there. But let me work us up to that thought a little bit, give us some context about why we're doing that. Okay. So, we're all familiar with the agricultural model, correct? Is anyone not familiar with the agricultural model? We're all good, squared away on that, yes? Okay. So we're going to be using the agricultural model and identifying how it relates to, how we can use the agricultural model to to look at U.S. history and how we can apply U.S. history to the agricultural model. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. And we're going to use specifically a quotation from Great Controversy, 440 and 441. GC 440 and 441. So before we actually read that quotation, let's just quickly remind ourselves of the agricultural model. So we know that before the time of, what's the first thing we have? Let's just run through it very quickly. What's the first step in the agricultural model? Okay, let me say it this way. What's the step before the step? What? Fallow ground. So we have fallow ground. So we have this field, and this field has a bunch of tares in it, or maybe tares is the wrong word. It has a bunch of weeds in it. And we need to take that field and we need to bring it to a certain place. And the place we need to bring it to is a plowed field. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to plow. And since we're all familiar with this, we know that this is the time of the end. We have a fallow field. Now we're going to plow, and then we get a field that looks like this. Nice plowed field. What's the next thing that's going to happen? We'll say from 9/11. We have the sowing of the seed. So we have our little seed here, gets sown. And what comes also with the seed? What does the seed need? Rain. Which rain? Former rain. So we get our former rain, or early rain, and our seed sowing here. Then what comes next? Now that we have this seed, it's going to grow up into a little plant. And what comes next? What rain does it need now? The latter rain. So then we get this latter rain. And finally, last thing, harvest. Okay, so this is our agricultural model. We're all familiar with it, so we don't need to get into a lot of detail with it. Here, this model is what we're going to use to place United States history on, this model here. And so what we're going to do now that we've just identified this agricultural model, I want to read this quote and I want to point something out. Okay, so this is Great Controversy 440. Now the context of this is that she's talking about Revelation 13, and she's talking about the rise of the United States. So that's sort of the context of this passage. What nation of the New World was in 1798 rising into power, giving promise and strength and greatness, and attracting the nations of the world? The attention of the world. The application of the symbol admits of no question. One nation and one only meets the specifications of this prophecy being Revelation 13. It points unmistakably to the United States of America. Again and again, the thought, almost the exact words of the sacred writer, have been unconsciously employed by the orator and the historian in describing the rise and growth of this nation. The beast was seen as coming up out of the earth, and she has that in quotation. She's quoting it from Revelation 13. And according to the translators, the word here rendered coming up literally signifies to grow or spring up as a plant. And then we're going to end the quote there. So what we see here is that in Revelation 13, there's a reference to the parable, or let me say it this way, to the agricultural model. And what specifically is it identifying? It says the coming up out of the earth literally signifies to grow or spring up as a plant. So what point are we talking about? The what? In the agricultural model. So 9/11, we'd be pointing right here in this history here. The sowing and the springing up of that seed. So Revelation 13 verse 11 is drawing us here to this point. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go to Revelation 13 and we'll start looking at that. And let's just read that verse here for just a moment and then we'll back up. So Revelation 13:11, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And so here the term coming up out of the earth signifies to spring up as a plant. Now what's interesting about this is that even the context of this is agricultural, in the sense that it's coming up out of the earth. And the only things that come up out of the earth are plants. So it's sort of, even on the surface level of it, you can read that. Though I know we haven't always thought of it that way. We sort of think of it like a beast coming up, in sort of this destructive kind of way. But what we see here is that it's pointing us to the agricultural model and its translation. So it's placing us right here at this point of the sowing of the seed. Now the problem is, what's our problem now? Now that we have this, what's our problem? So we have this point, and let's get rid of 9/11. 9/11 is sort of just the point we're talking about with the agricultural model. So I'm not pinning it to 9/11, just that place when you overlay the agricultural model. But here we have this transition, the sowing of the seed, the plowing to the sowing of the seed, and we have this point. What date do I put on this? 1798. So that's what we got from that paragraph there. Sister White is telling us that 1798, the coming up out of the earth, is this plant situation, and it's pointing us to 1798. The United States is coming up out of the ground. So now that we have this, what is our next problem? What do we have to do? We have to figure out what all the other points are. Because really, what we have right now is, let me just erase some of this just so we can see it a little more clearly. We don't know anything else, right? We don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know any of those waymarks. The only thing we know for sure is this waymark. Now, what's so amazing about methodology and about parable teaching, specifically the models, and what are our main forms of models? There's a couple. What are they? We have the agricultural. We have the agricultural. What was the other one? We have marriage. Marriage. There's an I somewhere. Where's the I? Is it right there? We have marriage and construction. What? Geography. 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 These are our main ones. So these different models, agricultural, marriage, construction, geography, are 4 amongst many. There's other ones you could use, of course, but these are primary ones that are going to be tools that we can use to understand the Bible, understand all inspiration, as we know. So the agricultural model, or marriage, or construction, or geography, is a template. It is like a ruler. Do we have a ruler? Anyone have a ruler? Cool. We have a ruler. So it's a ruler. The agricultural model is a ruler. It's this ruler right here. And this ruler has lines on it. It has little hash marks, obviously, for, what are you guys, is this centimeters or inches? I don't know where it is. They look like inches. So you have inches, and there's different delineations, different waymarks, different hash marks for a certain point on this line. Does that point on this line ever change, no matter what you hold it up to? No. So I can hold this up to anything. I could hold this up to the board, I could hold it up to my computer, I could hold it up to the marker, to me, whatever you want to hold it up against, you can put this ruler to, and it's always going to give you, the template is always going to stay the same. And you just hold it up against things, and then you can mark things. You can get your markers. That's what these models are. So the agricultural model is just a ruler that we can hold up against the Bible or a passage of inspiration and see how inspiration falls on this line, on this template. Does that make sense? And it's pretty easy, pretty simple stuff we should all be familiar with. So that's what we have to do. And so as we said, nothing changes on that line. So if I have, just to use it again, if I hold this up to, let's say I hold this up right here, and I mark 1798 as 12. That's 12 inches. So I hold that up right here, and that's the only thing I have. I only have the 12. Does that mean, how do I say that? If I only have that 12, because I understand how this measuring system works, I can figure out where the 1 is, or where the 2 is, or where the 3, or where the 20 is, based upon where that 12 is, you know, because that's where 12 was marking. And we can figure out the rest of the line even if we only have one of these things, because it never changes, the structure of it never changes. It's always going to be the same. You just hold it up against that thing. Okay, so now that we have that, we know 1798 is the date we're looking at. We need to figure out these dates before. What do we need next? What would be our next step in figuring out these waymarks? Anyone?
Determining when in history America was fallow ground, and determine what point in history it underwent its plowing, and understanding what that actually looks like.
Okay.
Because the springing up is really the birth of the nation. We understand that to Americans, their birth was not 1798. It was at history prior. So it's determining what the other ones look like. And my other question is this interdispensational? Are we line entering into all of history? Is the harvest Sunday law close operation kind of thing? So I would have some questions that would determine how I populate the other lines.
So we have a couple questions. Let's write those questions down. First question you said was, what was the first one? Before interdispensational?
What period of American history was it fallow ground?
Okay.
And what is meant by the United States of America being that?
So
She going back to the beginning.
yes, she's going this way first. She's saying, okay, let's figure out this way mark before we hammer those ones out. So how do I write that? Can we simplify that? How do we simplify with that point that you're raising there?
Tracking its process.
What?
Tracking its process of springing up. You're going on.
Yeah.
Tracing its beginning.
I think more she's saying it's like what it looks like. What does it mean to be fallow in the context of a nation?
So it's what it looked like before it was born.
Maybe not. That's what we have to figure out. So we need to figure out, let's say it this way. Maybe a better way to encompass all of that in just one word would be a theme. We need to figure out the theme, because the theme will tell us what fallow ground looks like, and whatever the sowing of the seed or the plowing or fallow or the rains look like will be in the context or the theme of the line of it itself. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Is that an accurate way to summarize kind of what you're saying? So we need to figure out a theme. We need to figure out a theme. Second, we need to figure out, you said if it's interdispensational. What else? Whatever things, what other ways would we figure this out? What other things do we need?
Alright, the first part of the quotation here it says, one nation of the New World was in 1798 rising into power, giving promise of strength and greatness, etc. So there has to be because it's a new world, there has to be an old. So it is the end of the old that brings in the new. So then we have to look at the old.
So, amen. So one thing, let me put that into a different thing. You're definitely right. Let me say it just a little differently. We have to, where's she getting that from? Where's she getting the idea of an old world? Where does she get that concept? Where's she getting it from though? You're right, it's Europe, but where's she taking that from?
The history of it.
The history of it, she's being specific though. What's the context of what she's reading right now? We mentioned it. What passage is she quoting from? Revelation 13. So she's going to get, how does she get New World and Old World out of Revelation 13? So she's taking the sea and the earth and she's saying these represent two different spheres or places or, however you want to say that, geography. So another thing in the context of this, we know that this is derivative from Revelation 13, so we should understand Revelation 13 to understand something like the New World. So a very important reason one of the most important reasons that we need to understand Revelation 13 is because what have we done up until this moment? What have we done? We read a quote and we slapped it on a line. Totally out of context, right? Isn't that exactly what you did? I read you a quote and I said, look, there's something about agricultural model here, let's put it on a line. Totally out of context. We didn't read the verse before, we didn't read the verse after. I just told you, look, Revelation 13, 1798. Sorry, not Revelation 13, Revelation 13, 11. 1798, agricultural model, boom, put those two together. That's all we got. So, it's correct, I think, but the way we have to figure that out is by context, right? We need more than just to say, look, Revelation 13 is, throw this one passage on this one spot, very haphazardly. So, there's more we have to do. We have to understand the context here. So actually I'm going to erase Revelation 13 and I'm just going to say context. That's probably a better way to say it. Say again? History, yeah. And so I think that would be under context. We'll say history. Because you have to not only get the prophetic or the inspirational context, but you also have to get the historical context. Threading the theme, and we'll add that to here. We'll say threaded. A threaded theme. It can't just be one thing. You need a whole thing. In the example we gave, I think it was last night. Yes, we gave last night. So this is our agricultural model, and we say, okay, this is fallow field. This is plowing. This is seed being sown. We have the early rain, we have the immature fruit right here, and then we have a house being built. And then we have a harvest, and then we have, it would be crazy. You'd say, look, that doesn't make sense. That breaks the theme of this line, the threaded theme. And so you'd say, agriculture, agriculture, agriculture. The next step should be agriculture. It shouldn't be house and then agriculture. It shouldn't be construction and then agriculture. It should be agriculture all the way through. It just makes good sense, consistency. So that's part of that. That's threading your theme. What else? What other things can we use to figure this out? What other?
Compare and contrast.
Okay, compare and contrast. Yeah. Compare and contrast. How are we going to do that? You have to answer it. What? Because you brought it up.
Look at the old and compare it with the new.
So
The
you-
old world with the new world.
So you want to use compare and contrast when we start looking at the context of the passage, Revelation 13. Okay? And we'll hopefully do that in a minute. Any other things that we can do to help figure out, piece this puzzle together? So what we saw. Application, what do you mean by application?
Based on what we look, because there will be differences when you'll see similarities and also you'll see differences.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at the old and deriving more application from it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what we've done so far is we've pulled a thread. We saw a little gem, a little thing. We said, look, Revelation 13 has a reference to the agricultural model. And we saw, okay, what I know so far, what I can tell or what I suspect is that if I have my agricultural model and I know that Revelation 13:11, this coming up out of the earth, is 1798, because that's what we get from Sister White, that it's 1798 and we can place that here, then the next thing I need to do is I need to start populating that. So do you see how we started with just one thing, and now we're going to use one thing that was rather obvious to us, and now we have to use the rest of our methodology to start populating this line and figuring out the things that are going to be a little bit harder, because all of these other waymarks are not going to be as easy as this one waymark, unfortunately. This is like it's like a surface gem, one that's sort of at the top, and now that you've hit that little bit of gold or something right there, then you know to start digging in the area. It's like that.
Corresponding the jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly. So that's what we have so far, and that's what we're doing, just as hopefully we can understand that. So now that we have a couple things, let's start first with our context, our inspirational and historical context. So let's go to Revelation 13. Revelation 13. And like we said, we jumped right into Revelation 13:11, just right in the middle of the chapter, which breaks all sound rules and logic. Really what we need to do is we need to start in verse 1 and start working our way through. Now, for sake of time, we're not going to read all the way through some of these things. We're just going to hit some major points. But what we know, so let me ask this question. One thing I think that needs to be understood in chapters, in stories, in prophecy, and just stories in general of the Bible, of inspiration, is identifying a theme. Part of our problem is that we consider these things in such a surface level and so disconnectedly that we don't allow verses to be connected to the previous passage or the previous verses before. I don't know the best way to say that, or after. I don't know the best way to say that, but what I mean is this, is that we can read and we can say, okay, there's a beast that comes out of the sea, there's a beast that comes out of the earth, but we don't see how those things are necessarily connected. And I think we do right now, but in general, maybe in the past, we might not have seen that okay, well, why is God even talking about seas and earth? What is he trying to explain here? What's the theme of this passage? Or another way of saying that, instead of theme, is what story is being told here? And I think the idea of stories is one of the most underestimated ideas when we come to inspiration, because, and I think maybe maybe as humans in general, or maybe Christians, we are scared of the idea of stories because stories sound fictional or sensational or whatever. But in reality, if we really went into it, stories are the great controversy is a story that God is telling us. And you can show it very clearly. And that's on the biggest scale. But each chapter, each passage has its own story embedded in there that is being described, is a parable, which is just another way of saying a story. So what is the story of Revelation 13? If we were going to put a theme or a story on this passage, what would it be? Because we have to do two things. Let me say this before any comments. We have scales. So when we look at a theme and we want to thread that theme needs to be at the scale of Revelation 13, but it also needs to be on the scale of this large line that we're making that transcends Revelation 13. You see what I'm saying? So we need to have scales to our theme. Or at every scale, rather, let me say it this way, the other way around. At every scale, there's a theme that needs to be consistent. So we're going to take Revelation 13 and we're going to see this bigger theme, but we're also going to see the smaller theme of Revelation 13 itself. So what is the theme of Revelation 13? Brother Jason?
Rise and fall of nations.
What?
Rise and fall of nations.
Rise and fall of nations.
Earth and sea beast.
Earth and sea beast. What does that mean though? That's just... What story is being told about an earth and sea beast?
They're coming into power.
Coming into power, so similar to what Brother Jason is saying, a rise and fall of these two beasts. What else?
Yeah, I was thinking the rise and fall of the king of the north.
So, Sister Antonisha, where do you see the king of the north in this chapter? What verse?
It's prior knowledge.
You're bringing prior knowledge into it, which means you're breaking the rules. That's another rule. Another rule we could add up here is, which I guess really should be the first rule, is no prior knowledge. How do you OR? Prior knowledge. No, you're right. It obviously is a story about the king of the north. But you having that knowledge, that prior knowledge, is dangerous to interpreting the passage. Because even though you're right, and we know you're right, and that's exactly what the story is about to some degree, it is, if it wasn't right, and we just assumed it was the right information, you might lead us down the wrong road with that bit of information, but as we know, she's right. But stick to the passage. Stick to the language and what we see here. What is this story about? It's rise and fall of these beasts, rise and fall of nations. What else? Now, some of the things we're obviously going to have to take for granted because we don't have the time to identify every symbol and whatnot, but just to get the idea.
Work of deception.
What?
Work of deception.
A work of deception. Okay, there's a work of deception here. Where do you see the work of deception?
In particularly verses, let's say just from 12 below.
So you're saying 12, verse 12, okay. So this second beast is going to do a work of deception. Okay. What else? What is the relationship between the two beasts? So no matter what our theme is, what we're sure about of this theme is that it is centered around the interaction between these two beasts, between the sea beast and the earth beast. So what is their relationship? Are they friends? Are they enemies? Are they acquaintances?
Well, it says that the earth beast will make a copy of the sea beast.
Mm-hmm.
So probably there would be a relationship. Or the earth beast, like the fact of how the sea beast operates and wants to be like the sea beast.
Okay.
So maybe they don't have to have any relation, but it's just like I was watching, I was reading something about this king who he really loves. I think it's Napoleon. He loves how Alexander was mighty and he replicated his character. He wanted to be like him. It's not that they have any relationship. They didn't, because Alexander died a long years ago. But he wanted to follow in his footsteps.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe with this sea beast, wants to walk in the footsteps of the earth beast. Or the earth beast wants to walk.
Okay. Okay, because you're saying he's going to make an image to this beast.
I was just wondering about this principle, repeat and enlarge.
Okay.
I was wondering if that means is, even though we know that Revelation 13, the first piece is just repeating, and then the second piece will enlarge what the first piece has done in the past. I don't know if that can be
Mhm.
I was just thinking about.
You're seeing the development.
Hmm?
There's a development going on
Okay, development. To yours, Brother Jason, I know what you mean, and I think it's obviously right, but I don't know if you see it in this chapter. I think the repeat and enlarge aspect would be somewhere like Revelation 17. But it's definitely can be inferred in here with that knowledge if you brought it into here. But I don't think explicitly it's talking about a repeat and enlarge of this beast. Though you're right, it just from a different perspective. Yeah.
I'm going back to your previous question
Okay, what was my previous question?
about the theme.
Okay.
I think captivity is another theme that is illustrated in here because in the last parts of the verses, it speaks of him putting into bondage persons, but also before that, there is also mention of captivity that he that leadeth in the captivity will
Mhm.
go into itself.
Okay, so the issue of captivity is here. Okay. Yeah.
Wounded and dead.
What?
Wounded and dead.
Wounded and dead. Okay, that's part of it. So let me say this. Tell me a story with captivity or being wounded and dead. Because those are facts, but create a narrative. Create something, a story wrapped around that of Revelation 13 that talks about the story of captivity or the story of being wounded and dead. Do you know what I mean?
Another story.
What?
Another story you want?
No, not another story. Use this to tell that story.
Oh.
What is the story of captivity in Revelation 13?
The Pope.
Without even mentioning the history, just in the chapter.
So you want to tell us your story using the theme captivity?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we should be able to do that, is my point, with our theme, even without using the history. Something like the first beast was a persecuting beast, and we can derive that from these things. And what it says here is that if you how does it say? If you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. If you lead into captivity, you're going to go into captivity. So this beast is a persecuting power, but because of its actions, it's going to be brought into captivity, and then we see this next beast. And now that is where the story gets interesting, is this next beast, how it's going to fall into that, because what we see is that this second beast is going to commit the same sin as the first beast. And so there's that theme there that you can see. And I think part of this is you can see part of the story here is the corrupting of the second beast. But we can talk about that in a moment, that idea. So we've mentioned some of these things, just trying to get your mind flowing on just the dynamics of how we would address the idea of theme. So let's start attacking that a little bit, the idea of the theme. So let's do it by breaking down some things we know about Revelation 13. So for sure, we know that we have two beasts, and this story revolves around these two beasts. We have our first beast, our sea beast. And we have a land beast, or an earth beast. So, right off the bat, what do we see about these two beasts?
Where they are at.
What? They're opposites. So once we see that they're opposites, what do we have now? We know we're looking at the idea of compare and contrast. So compare and contrast is going to be a big part of this chapter, because really what's happening in this chapter is the juxtaposition or the compare and contrast between two beasts. It's a big part of what's going on here. So we see initially, the first thing we see in this compare and contrast is one is from the sea, one is from the land. And I'll put that down here. Sea. Okay. So now we identify that, okay, we're doing a compare and contrast between these two beasts. What do we see next? Tell me some more characteristics about this first beast, the sea beast. So what do we notice about the... What? Where do you find dictator? I think you can infer dictator, but it's not maybe right off the... It's maybe not at the surface there. So what do we see about these two beasts? What is associated with these two beasts?
Corn and rice.
What?
Corn and rice. On the right side. Two beasts right side.
Okay.
More than that is two beasts.
They have
7 heads and 7 arms.
Okay. And what is, after the horns, what is it going to tell you about these beasts? What's associated with them?
they speak dialect.
What? Animals. So there's going to be animals associated with these two beasts. Both of them have beasts attached to them. So what is the first beast? What animals do we see attached to that? Lion, bear, leopard, and who gave him power? Dragon. So we have a dragon. Okay, what is our second beast? What do we see about him?
It has horns like a lamb
He has horns like a lamb.
and speaks like a dragon.
He has horns like a lamb and he speaks like a dragon. So we have a lamb and a dragon. Now, if I can say it this way, one of these things is not like the others. Which one is that? The lamb. So the lamb is the odd one out. Because why is it the odd one out, Sister Antonisha?
It's the most docile of the creatures.
It's the most docile, yes. That's one way we could say it. What else?
And when you research the leopard, the bear, and the lion, they're alpha predators.
Oh.
So those are predatorial, and the lamb isn't.
So we have predators and prey. So lion, bear, leopard, dragon are all predator animals. They're aggressive predator killing animals. But a lamb is the exact opposite. It doesn't eat meat, it's not a carnivore, and it is a docile prey animal. So do we see that juxtaposition? So in this chapter we have the juxtaposition of predator and prey. We see those two things identified, yep?
The second beast is speaking as a dragon.
And this one's going to speak as a dragon, yeah.
Yeah, the first one is having a mouth like a lion.
Like a what?
Having a mouth like a lion.
A mouth like a lion. Okay, this one has a mouth like a lion, and this one's going to speak as a dragon. Both of their speaking is predatory. So that's another thing we see in this compare and contrast. Now, the way you have to handle this lamb and dragon, can you be a lamb and a dragon at the same time? No. You can't be a predator and a prey at the same time. I mean, you could, but it doesn't really work that way in the animal kingdom. Either you're a predator or you're a prey. Either you eat meat or you don't. It's that kind of situation. So here, what do we see? What do we see about this sea beast in relationship to its animals? It's homogeneous. All of these animals are predators. It's the same. It's pure. It's purely a predator. But the problem with the land beast is that there's either a transition or there's some problem in that it has two contradicting themes going on. It's that a predator or a prey and a predator. And we have to be able to explain that because one is homogeneous, it's all the same. One is a mix. Well, it's contradictory. So we see that? So we have to be able to explain that. And before we get to that, one of the things, so what we know about this first beast is that it's a predator. It persecutes. Because we know that we're talking about nations, and again, we're inferring that information, we're bringing that into it, but if we went to other passages, we could define those symbols, but just for sake of time, we're not going to do that. So we have this predatory nation, and we have a nation that is contradictory in its essence, in its form. What is the chapter? How do we say that? What comes first, the lamb or the dragon?
The lamb.
Why?
It says it speaks, like,
Prove it from the passage.
Because it just comes up, so it's still young, still tender.
Okay. But let me ask you this. If you, being very literal, if you come up out of the earth, don't you have the mouth that you're going to have and you're going to have the horns that you're going to have? So how do we know which? But we know that you can't be both of these at the same time, so we have to pick. In the imagery, both of those things seem to be happening at the same time. But we know that in good logic, you can't be both of those things at the same time. So we know that in some instance, somehow, one of these has to happen before the other, and I want to know how we figure that out.
It says he had 2 horns like a lamb, right? So I'm figuring it out. He's coming out of the earth, the horn is on the head. So that would be one.
Comes up first, you're saying?
Yeah.
Like pops up out of the, okay, maybe. Okay, that's one way you could approach it. What else? How else can we look at the whole context of the chapter? How else would we figure out what comes first? Or last? You know, if you can figure out one, you figure out the other.
I'm using
What?
the analogy of a child. When the child is born, when a baby is born, it grows and it develops. It learns to speak, it learns bad habits and those kind of things. And then when it becomes fully grown, it becomes a monster.
Okay.
if something's like something, there has to be something there original to be like something else. See what I mean?
Elaborate on that.
The lamb is like, so then there has to be something there for it to emulate.
Okay. I think in this context, though, it's taking it from nature. It's saying it's a mix of prophecy and nature at the same time. It's saying, okay, it has 2 horns like a lamb, and it's just describing something you already know, the fact that there's a lamb, and it's trying to describe this animal to you and say, look, it's this weird animal, and it had 2 horns that are similar to the horns of a lamb, or like a lamb, or a lamb. So, anyway, yeah. Yep.
Yes, I was saying that either animals, when the animals or plants, as they emerge or born, you know that there are signs. If it is a plant, right, and it emerges on the side, like a poisonous plant, it is harmless, and you can't touch it and be fully depressed. You know,
Okay.
Same with the animal, because if a baby lion, it is harmless. You can't do anything, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Until it gets big, until it is fully developed, you know, so probably they can kill it, you don't know, that's not, they develop that nature to kill.
Okay, so at their conception, things are normally more harmless.
Yeah, harmless, yes.
Okay.
They're fully developed to that nature to kill.
Mhm.
I'm going to go back to great controversy.
Oh, you're not allowed. We're sorry. You have to stay in the chapter.
Can I use the concept that our knowledge that this is the end of the world? What he's really talking. The
Say again?
End of the world, the last period. Just using the context of it, realizing that the mark of the beast is just the last.
So, I would say that the end of the world, you can't read the end of the world in here.
What is the last phase? I know.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying that I can use that knowledge.
Yeah, don't use that knowledge, but I think you're onto something. So you're saying the end of the chapter ends with this beast being bad. It's being a bad beast. It's doing all these bad things like the previous beast. So the last information we have about this beast is that it's bad. So
There's no more information that comes up and says that it turns or it changes
Yeah.
or something goes. So I'm just assuming therefore that this is the last part.
the last part of it would be the bad part, and so the first part would be the good part. Okay, I think that, yeah, we could do that. That's a good way of doing it. The last information we have is that he's like this other beast, Brother Jason.
I was just wondering, is that the beast is a lamb? It changed from a lamb to speaking as a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, I'm trying to put the beast
So you're saying is the lamb deception? I think the character is pure. I mean the lamb. If you're a lamb, you're a lamb. You're a good lamb. You're not a fake lamb.
Okay, so can we then use what we were using last night in a sense, with the spirit of the Lord and the letter of the Lord? It's called nature of the man and the spirit of the man. So the first thing that we see is outward character. We see that he looks like a lamb, but once he opens his mouth, the mouth is what reveals the last part of who he is. Because when you see someone, the first thing that impresses you is this outside character, the looks. Right, so that's the lamb part, that he looks like a lamb. But when they start to speak, then you get the full end of the man per se.
So let's bring all that to a conclusion, to a conclusive thought. Take that logic out. Then, from its conception, the United States has been a dragon.
Oh.
Is that what you mean?
I don't know. I wouldn't really say that, but
Do you see how that would lead that to that point?
Yeah.
You'd say that from the very beginning, everything the United States has ever done is that of a dragon power.
But is that wrong?
What?
Is that wrong?
Yeah.
I think in the context of the chapter it is.
Yeah, because what?
We have two body parts for this second week. For the first week, we had a lot more. We had the body.
We have the parts, yeah.
But then I don't know why we keep doing it, and it's a trap we set for ourselves. We keep saying that the beast is a lamb, and not that it is a dragon. And we say it is a lamb because it has lamb-like horns, but then shouldn't it be a dragon because it speaks like a dragon? So I think we need to differentiate what the beast actually is. It's not that it is a lamb.
It's not a lamb, yeah.
It's that its horns are lamb-like and its mouth, it too is a composite beast.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that we cannot tell to what degree what its bodily form is as we could with the sea beast, because its entire body is that of a leopard. We get less information, and I don't know why. We get less information for the second beast than for the first. And I agree with what Tamara had alluded to earlier, because
What did she say? What did she say?
the rising up of verse 1 is the same Hebrew word as coming up in verse 11. So it's this, whatever it means for the United States of America is what it means for this beast. When we look at 13 verse 1, and we may be carving out a word for ourselves that is bigger than is currently possible, because to juxtapose the first beast with the second beast would have to do a similar line for the first beast and then say, oh yeah, we have the skill set now to do it for the second one.
Mm-hmm.
And
We can do both, yeah.
And it's a nice point to confirm
We're going to do both.
the similarity or the parable that Rome is to the United States of America, which I never knew we could prove biblically before today. And now we have our point of reference.
Amen. So, yeah, I think, so one of the points she makes is that this beast isn't a lamb, it's lamb, it has horns like a lamb, or it has lamb horns. It has lamb horns and it speaks like a dragon. It has a dragon mouth and lamb horns. And it is itself as much a composite beast as these other ones. The problem with this beast versus that beast is that this one has a contradictory nature, this one has a pure nature all the way through. But this one, there's this contradiction between lamb and dragon, and I don't think you can be a lamb and a dragon at the same time. Though those parts, if you want to be technical, both those parts are there from the beginning, you have to be one and then the other. And I think part of the story here of Revelation 13 is the corrupting of this second beast, in it turning into the first beast, or at least turning into a exercising all the power of the first beast, at least a representative of it. Yep.
The dragon, the land is its own appearance of the land. Its character has not changed.
Say again?
Appearance. You say the character of the dragon of the land beast is still the same. But the appearance has changed slightly.
I would say it the other way around. The appearance is one way and the character changes. Again, because you can't be a predator and a prey at the same time.
Yeah.
Does it help determining which comes first? Does it help us solve the problem of what is the time of the end?
Yes. It would help us. Because here's why. So what we're seeing in this chapter is that the sea beast and the lamb beast are opposites. And the way they're opposites is in this lambness, the lamb-likeness, and of the landness. The land and the lamb are the opposite things to this first beast. Now, there's obviously similarities once the character changes, but if we know that the lamb comes first, it helps us to solve this conundrum here, because what we're going to inevitably see is that this land beast is the answer to the sea beast. Because there's a problem in this chapter, and what's the problem? What's the problem that we see in Revelation 13? It's the fact that you have a persecuting beast. You have the first beast, and it's persecuting. It's doing all the wrong things. It's hurting people. It's speaking blasphemy. It's doing all of these things, and it's going to go into captivity, is what we saw. And that is verse 11. So it goes into captivity, verse 10. And this other beast is going to take its place, but this other beast is the opposite to this first beast. There's the fact that they're opposites in nature. And what we see is that what does the fallow field represent in the parable of the agriculture and the methodology of agriculture? Sin, okay. Let's say it this way. Don't take the spiritual aspect of it. What is it in the context of the rest of this line?
Thorns.
What? Thorns, yes. What is the purpose? Don't take a spiritual theme. Think just agriculturally, simplistically. What is the agricultural model all about? What are you trying to do? You want to plant stuff and produce food, right? That's what the agricultural model is all about. It's about producing a plant. But there's something in the way. What's in the way? This thorny field is it's not ready. It's in the way of your of the process that you want to do, which is to make the process of agriculture, and get yourself to the point of harvest. So the field represents, the thorny field, the fallow field represents the problem. It represents, or obstacle. What is the plowed field? What is the plowing of the field and the rest of this? It's the solution. So you have the problem and the obstacle, and then you have the solution to that problem. Right? Do we see that? So this is how the plowing of the field and the beginning of the agricultural model is the solution to a broken fallow field, or to a...
So that's the American Revolutionary War.
That's what we're going to talk about. That idea is what is the problem and what is the solution? And what we've identified so far is that if this is our second beast that we're looking at here, which we know it is, that the problem of Revelation 13 is persecution. It's that you have a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a dragon. It speaks blasphemy. It does all these bad things, and it's represented by the sea. And the opposite of that is a beast that comes out of the land, opposite to sea, and it is like a lamb, which is the opposite to all of these things. So there's a problem, and then the answer to that is the solution. But obviously, as we know, it's not that simple. Because what happens to this beast is this beast, though it starts well, is going to end up being corrupted. And it turns into a dragon. It turns into the character of a dragon. Because again, it has both of these things. It is a composite piece like Antonisha was saying. But that compositeness is different than any other composite beast that we have ever seen in all of the biblical prophecies. When you think about it, there's never been another composite beast that has the essence of contradiction inside of it. And that contradiction is really significant to the overall narrative that we see here. Does that make sense, what we're saying?
So it's interdispensational.
Interdispensational. Which now we can answer that a little bit. So we have 1798 here, and we know that this is the rise of the United States. So the question is, what was the problem to getting you to the point of 1798 where you would have the rise of the United States? And if we just brought in our information about Ellen White, just for sake of time, if we bring that information to bear, we find that the problem here is what Antonisha said. It is the sea. It is this history here. It's the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the dragon. It's Europe. The problem for the United States is Europe. But we'll talk more about that in our next class. So we're going to end there for now. And I'm not sure what our break will be, but we can talk about that. We'll end now, and then we'll pick up in a little bit. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this first class that we've had and this morning. And we thank you for the methodology that you've given us, the tools of interpretation to figure out what you're trying to say to us, and to solidly and conclusively be able to interpret your word, Lord. And we thank you that you've given us such a tremendous amount of knowledge here at the end of the world, these tools that have never been fully understood up until this time. And we just thank you for the privilege of being here in this time that we live, to have this glorious light shine upon us. We thank you and we love you. In Jesus' name, amen.